There is a moment in Genesis that most people read past without stopping. Not because it is boring, because it is strange enough to make you uncomfortable if you slow down long enough to actually feel it. You are 6 chapters into the Bible. The world has been created. Adam and Eve have come and gone from the garden. Cain has killed Abel. Generations have lived and died. Each one listed by name. Each one given a number of years that stretches into the hundreds. The story has a rhythm. It feels like it is building towards something. And then, right before the flood, Genesis pauses. Voorvers. That is all it gives you. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. Voorvers. Then God looks down, sees that the wickedness of humanity is great, and decides to destroy everything. The Nephilim are never explained. They are never judged. They are never given a single line of dialogue or a single moment where the camera, so to speak, stays on them long enough to show you who they actually are. They appear. They are named. And then the story moves on to Noah and the ark and the end of the world as anyone had known it. That silence has been filling up for 2,500 years. This is the story of what people poured into it, and what that says about the questions we have never been able to stop asking. Picture a translator sitting alone with the oldest surviving manuscripts of Genesis. Not a modern scholar with a laptop and a database. Someone working centuries ago, surrounded by scrolls, trying to carry a text from one language into another without losing what makes it true. They come to Genesis chapter 6. They read the 4 verses. And they face a problem that every translator of this passage has faced since the moment anyone tried to render it into a different tongue. The Hebrew is not clear. That is not a criticism of the text. The Hebrew Bible is one of the most carefully preserved documents in human history, copied by scribes who would recount entire pages if a single letter was wrong, who treated each word as something that could not be replaced or altered without consequence. The unclarity in Genesis 6 is not an accident of transmission. It is built into the text, and the more carefully you look at it, the more you realize that the questions most people assume have obvious answers do not have obvious answers at all. Start with the word itself, Nephilim. Ask most people what Nephilim means, and they will say giants. That answer comes from going to translation made roughly 2,000 years ago, when Jewish scholars in Alexandria rendered the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Their translation is called the Septuagint, and it became one of the most influential documents in the history of Western religion. When the Septuagint reaches the word Nephilim, it renders it as gigantes. But gigantes in ancient Greek does not simply mean large people. The word comes from the Greek tradition of the gigantes, beings born from the earth itself, from the blood of the sky god, Oranos, when he was wounded. Gigantes means earth-born. It means something that belongs to the ground, that comes from below rather than from above. When the Alexandrian scholars chose that word for Nephilim, they were not just saying these beings were physically large. They were placing them inside a whole category of creature that their Greek-speaking readers would have immediately understood. Something powerful, something ancient, something that exists at the boundary between the divine world and the world of matter. That is a lot of weight to carry from a single translation choice. The Hebrew word Nephilim almost certainly comes from a root. Scholars have been arguing for centuries about which root. The most common argument connects it to the verb naphal, which means to fall. Under this reading, Nephilim means the fallen ones, or those who have fallen, or perhaps those who cause others to fall. But the grammar of that connection is disputed. Other scholars argue that the word is simply a proper name, a title, something that functioned in the ancient world, the way a word like Vikings functions in modern English. Not a description of what these beings did, but what they were called. And there is a third argument, less popular but worth sitting with, that Nephilim might be a word borrowed from another language entirely, a term that arrived in Hebrew from the wider ancient Near Eastern world, along with other vocabulary that crossed cultural boundaries freely in the ancient world. Under this reading, the word's meaning in Hebrew is almost secondary to the associations it would have carried for readers who knew where it came from. None of these arguments has settled the matter. Scholars working today still disagree, and that disagreement matters for everything that follows. Because if you do not know what the word means, you do not know what Genesis is telling you these beings are. Now look at the structure of the 4 verses themselves. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, is made up of several distinct claims sitting next to each other in a way that modern readers tend to assume are causally connected, but which the Hebrew text does not explicitly connect. The sons of God see the daughters of men and find them beautiful. The sons of God take wives from among them. God responds with a statement about human mortality and the limits of his spirit remaining with humanity. And then, in what feels like a separate statement, the text says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also afterward. Read that carefully. Also afterward. That phrase is sitting there quietly, and most people glide over it. But it is one of the strangest things in the entire passage. If Nephilim are the product of the union between sons of God and daughters of men, and if the flood is about to destroy everything, then what does also afterward mean? Afterward, which event? Afterward, the unions. Afterward, the flood. The phrase opens a question that the text immediately declines to answer. Then there is the relationship between the Nephilim and the sons of God. Modern readers almost universally assume that the Nephilim are the offspring of these unions. The text does not say that. It places the two statements next to each other, and the proximity creates the impression of causality. But the Hebrew syntax does not require that reading. Some scholars have argued that the Nephilim in Genesis 6 are a separate category, entirely from the children born of the unions. That the text is describing 2 different groups of remarkable beings who happen to exist at the same time. Others have argued the opposite, that the connection is implied so strongly by the structure of the passage that the text assumes the reader already knows a fuller version of the story and does not need it spelled out. That second argument raises something important. What if Genesis 6 is not the beginning of the story? What if it is a reference to a story, a condensed version of something that the original audience would have known in more detail from other sources? What if the 4 verses are not a complete account, but a shorthand, a reminder of a tradition that has since been partially lost? That possibility changes everything about how you read the silence. because silence in a carefully composed text is not the same as emptiness. Silence can be a signal. It can be the mark of something the writer is assuming you already know, something they did not feel the need to explain, because it did not require explanation for the people they were writing for. The people who first read Genesis 6 may not have needed the Nephilim explained. They may have known exactly what the word meant, exactly what the sons of God were, exactly what happened and why. The text was written for them, inside a world of shared knowledge and shared storytelling that we no longer have direct access to. What we have instead is the text, 4 verse, and the long, unfinished work of people trying to recover what those verses assumed you already knew. The last thing to notice before moving on is where these 4 verses sit in the larger structure of Genesis. The verses come at the end of a long genealogy, the line of Seth stretching from Adam down through 10 generations to Noah. Each generation is listed with its lifespan, and the lifespans are extraordinary, hundreds of years each. The world before the flood is populated by people who live so long they seem barely mortal. And into this world, at the end of this genealogy, right before God decides to end it all, the text drops the Nephilim. They are the last thing before the judgment, not the cause of the judgment. At least not explicitly. Not even the worst thing about the world at that moment. Since Genesis immediately pivots to talk about human wickedness in terms that have nothing specifically to do with giants or divine unions. But they are there, at the threshold, right at the edge of the old world, just before the water comes. That positioning is not accidental. In a text this carefully constructed, nothing is accidental. The question is what the positioning means. And that question leads directly to the most contested debate in the entire history of Nephilim interpretation. A debate that split Jewish and Christian readers for centuries and has never been fully resolved. Who were the sons of God? In the year 180 or thereabouts, a Christian bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon sat down to write a defense of what he believed was Orthodox Christianity against a range of teachings he considered dangerously wrong. Irenaeus was a careful thinker and a thorough one. When he got to the question of Genesis 6, he gave the angelic interpretation. The idea that the sons of God were divine beings who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth. He accepted it. He built on it. He treated it as the natural reading of the text. By the time of Augustine of Hippo, roughly 2 centuries later, the angelic interpretation had become a problem, not because the text had changed, but because the theological landscape around it had. Augustine looked at Genesis 6 and refused to read sons of God as angels. He said the idea of angels having physical relations with human women was philosophically incoherent and theologically dangerous. He proposed a different reading, one that would eventually become dominant in Western Christianity and remain dominant for over 1,000 years. The story of how that happened is the story of how a single phrase in the Bible became a battleground for 3 completely different understandings of what the text was actually about. The first reading is the oldest. It appears in Jewish texts from centuries before the birth of Christianity, and it takes the phrase, sons of God, at its most direct, most literal meaning. In the Hebrew Bible, the phrase Bene ha Elohim, sons of God, appears in several places outside Genesis 6. In the book of Job, it refers unmistakably to members of the divine council, heavenly beings who stand before God and are clearly distinct from human beings. In Psalm 89, the sons of God are described as a heavenly assembly. The phrase, in its natural Hebrew context, points toward beings that belong to the divine realm, not the human one. Under this reading, Genesis 6 is describing something genuinely cosmic. Beings from the divine sphere crossed a boundary they were not supposed to cross. They saw human women and acted on that desire. The result was something that should not exist. Offspring that belonged to two worlds and therefore fit fully into neither. The emotional weight of this reading is significant. If the sons of God are divine beings, then the corruption of the pre-flood world was not primarily humanity's fault. It was caused by something from above. The world was contaminated by a violation that originated in the heavenly sphere, and the flood that followed was the response to that contamination. Humanity is, in some sense, caught in the consequences of a transgression it did not initiate. This reading also raises a question that would trouble theologians for centuries. If powerful divine beings could simply decide to descend to earth and act on human desires, what does that say about the boundaries of divine order? What does it say about the stability of the heavenly realm? These are uncomfortable questions, and the discomfort they created would eventually push significant portions of the tradition toward a different reading entirely. The second reading emerges fully formed in the writings of early Christian scholars from the 3rd and 4th centuries. Though its roots may go back further, it is called the Sethite interpretation, and it works by redefining the key terms in the passage. Under this reading, the sons of God are not divine beings at all. They are the righteous descendants of Seth, the son born to Adam and Eve after the death of Abel, the son described in Genesis as the one through whom people began to call on the name of God. In Sethite interpretation, the sons of God are those who maintained faith and covenant relationship with God through the generations. The line of the godly, the daughters of men, correspondingly, are not simply all human women. They are the daughters of the ungodly line, the descendants of Cain, or, more broadly, the women of a humanity that had turned away from God. When the sons of God see the daughters of men and find them beautiful, they are doing something that looks harmless on the surface, choosing marriage partners based on physical attraction. But they are crossing a boundary between two spiritual orientations, between faithfulness and unfaithfulness. And the result of that crossing is the dissolution of the distinction that had kept righteousness alive in the world. The Sethite reading was preferred by Augustine, and the reasons for that preference reveal something important about the theological concerns of his era. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity had developed a strong interest in defining the boundaries between the divine and the human. The idea of divine beings having physical relations with human women suggested a kind of porousness between those categories that created significant problems. It raised questions about the nature of angels, about the nature of bodies, about what kind of beings could or could not experience physical desire. The Sethite interpretation avoided all of those problems. If the sons of God were simply faithful human men, then Genesis 6 was a story about intermarriage, about the dangers of letting spiritual commitments be overridden by physical attraction. That was a story with a clear moral. It was a story that did not require rethinking the boundaries of the divine sphere. It was inavoured, safer. But safety comes at a cost. The Sethite reading makes the Nephilim seem almost ordinary. If Nephilim are simply the children of mixed marriages between different human groups, then calling them by a special name, saying they were the heroes of old, men of renown. Seems like an overreaction. The Sethite reading explains the moral problem in the passage, but leaves the Nephilim themselves oddly unexplained. The third reading is, in some ways, the most modern, though it has roots in ancient scholarship. It approaches the phrase, sons of God, not as a description of divine beings or of spiritually distinguished human beings, but as a title of political power. In the ancient Near East, kings routinely described themselves as sons of God, or as divine, or as the chosen representatives of divine power on earth. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we will get to in detail later, describes its hero as two-thirds divine. Akkadian royal inscriptions describe kings as born of divine parents. The connection between political authority and divine origin was not just propaganda. It was a cosmological claim. The person who ruled was the person through whom divine order was expressed in the human world. Under this reading, the sons of God in Genesis 6 are rulers, powerful men, those who had elevated themselves to a status that claimed divine sanction. Their taking of wives is not a romantic choice or a spiritual failing. It is an assertion of power. They take whom they want, because they are the kind of men who take what they want. The Nephilim who result from this world are not supernatural hybrids. They are what you get when unchecked power reproduces itself across generations. They are the mighty men, the men of renown, precisely because they come from a world where power was the only thing that mattered. This reading makes Genesis 6 into a political text as much as a supernatural one. It transforms the pre-flood world into a world that looks uncomfortably familiar. A world where the strong take from the weak, where power justifies itself, where the accumulation of might is treated as its own validation. And then the flood comes. Here is the thing that all three readings share, and it matters more than the differences between them. Each reading is trying to explain what went wrong. Each is trying to locate the source of the corruption that made the flood necessary. Each is trying to answer the question of how a world that God had called good became a world that God decided had to be destroyed. The angelic reading says the corruption came from above, from beings who should have known better and acted worse. The Sethite reading says the corruption came from within, from the slow dissolution of the distinction between faithfulness and faithlessness. The royal reading says the corruption came from power, from the way human authority, when it is freed from every constraint, inevitably turns toward domination. Three sources of corruption. Three ways a world can fall apart. And Genesis 6 places, all of them in the same 4 verses, under the shadow of the same 4 letters, waiting for 25 centuries of readers to decide which answer they can live with. Each answer solves one problem, and each answer creates another, which is probably exactly what the text intended. In the winter of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Muhammad Ed-Dib was looking for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave to startle the animal out. Instead of the sound of a goat scrambling to its feet, he heard something break. He climbed in to look. What he found were large clay jars, sealed and ancient, and inside them were scrolls wrapped in linen, blackened with age, written in a language he could not read. He had no way of knowing that what he was holding was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. He had no way of knowing that those scrolls had been sitting in that cave for roughly 2,000 years, placed there by a community of Jewish men who had carried them into the desert to keep them safe from the Roman army advancing on Jerusalem. He had no way of knowing that when scholars finally examined everything recovered from those caves over the following decade, they would find multiple copies of a text that most of the Western world had not read in over 1,000 years. That text was First Enoch. Not one copy, not two. Fragments of 11 separate manuscripts of First Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The only texts represented by more copies were Psalms and Deuteronomy. Think about what that means. A community of Jewish men living in the desert in the century before the birth of Jesus. A community that took its scripture seriously enough to preserve it in sealed jars in the hope that someone would find it later. Considered First Enoch important enough to keep 11 copies of it. They read it the way you read something you believe is true. Not as folklore, not as entertainment, as a key to understanding how the world actually worked. And the reason First Enoch was that important to them is that it did something Genesis refused to do. It explained the Nephilim. The story that First Enoch tells begins not with 4 vague verses, but with a scene that is specific and strange and impossible to forget once you have read it. 200 angels stand on the summit of Mount Hermon. The text gives their leader a name, Shemihaza, and Shemihaza has a problem. He wants to descend to earth. He wants to take human women as wives. But he knows that what he is proposing is a violation, a crossing of a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. And he is afraid that if he leads them down and the others lose their nerve, he will be the only one who bears the guilt of what they have done. So he asks for a pledge. Every one of the 200 must swear an oath that they will go through with it, all of them together, so that the guilt falls equally on all of them, and none can blame another for their choice. They swear on that mountain, in that oath. The decision is made. What happens next in First Enoch is not the compressed shorthand of Genesis. It is a fully realized story, told with the kind of detail that suggests the author had thought deeply about what this world actually looked like from the inside. The Watchers, as First Enoch calls them, come down. They choose wives, and from those unions are born children of extraordinary size. The text gives numbers that stretch the imagination, figures that scholars have debated endlessly as literal description or as the symbolic language of a tradition trying to express something that ordinary human scale cannot contain, whatever their precise dimensions. The giants that emerge from these unions are defined primarily not by their height, but by their appetite. They eat everything humanity has. When the food runs out, they turn to animals. When the animals are gone, they begin to eat human beings. And when even that is not enough, the text says, they begin to consume each other. The world of First Enoch before the flood is not a world of heroes and mighty men in any sense that invites admiration. It is a world coming apart at the seams. A world in which the basic structures that make life possible have been destroyed by something that was introduced from outside. But the Watchers bring more than violence. They bring knowledge. This is the part of First Enoch that is easy to underestimate, and it is the part that the ancient communities who read this text found most disturbing. One of the Watchers, named Azazel, teaches human beings how to make weapons from metal, swords, knives, shields and breastplates. He also teaches women the art of adornment, how to use cosmetics, how to beautify themselves in ways that were not natural. And First Enoch places these two teachings side by side without distinguishing between them in terms of their moral weight. The weaponsmith and the cosmetics instructor are guilty of the same thing. Other watchers teach the movements of stars and the cycles of the moon. They teach enchantments and the cutting of roots. They teach how to read omens and how to perform rituals that claim power over the invisible world. The point is not that these things are evil in themselves. The point is that humanity received them before humanity was ready for them. The knowledge was not the problem. The timing was. And the person who gave a child a knife before the child understood what knives were for bears a different kind of responsibility than the knife itself. Enoch himself enters the story as an intermediary. In Genesis, Enoch is listed in the genealogy of Seth with a single remarkable annotation: he walked with God and was no more. Because God took him. No death, just a disappearance. Just a man who was so fully in relationship with the divine that the normal boundary between life and death did not apply to him in the usual way. First Enoch takes that brief description and builds a complete cosmology around it. If Enoch walked with God, then Enoch saw things that other human beings did not see. He traveled through the heavens. He witnessed the machinery of the cosmos. He saw where the winds were kept and where the dead went and how the stars were governed. And he was given the task of delivering messages between the heavenly realm and the earth, including a message to the watchers themselves. God sends Enoch to the watchers with a verdict. There will be no forgiveness for what they have done. Their children will destroy each other. The giants will die by violence. And from their bodies, something will remain. Spirits without a home, wandering the earth as the agents of affliction that humanity will struggle with for generations. The watchers themselves will be bound. They will watch the destruction of everything they created, and they will never return. Now, step back from the story for a moment and ask what First Enoch is actually doing. Genesis 6 raises a question without answering it. Something called the sons of God crossed a boundary. Something called the Nephilim existed. The world became corrupt. The flood came. None of it is explained. First Enoch answers all of it. It gives the sons of God a name and a number, and a location and a motivation. It gives the Nephilim a story that explains both their power and their appetite. It explains why the world required the flood, not as a general response to human wickedness, but as the specific consequence of a specific violation. And it does something that Genesis does not do. It assigns responsibility clearly. The corruption came from above. Humanity suffered the consequences of a choice made by beings who should have known better. That is a profound theological move, and it is not an arbitrary one. The communities that preserved First Enoch, and the broader tradition of Enochic literature that flourished in the centuries before and after the birth of Jesus, were communities that lived inside a world of suffering that they could not explain by reference to their own choices alone. The Jewish people under Greek and then Roman domination were not suffering because they had abandoned their God. Many of them were the most faithful people in the world by any measure they could apply. And yet the world was full of violence, of injustice, of power that crushed the righteous and rewarded the wicked. First Enoch gave that world a history. The violence and injustice that saturated human experience were not accidental. They were the legacy of something that had gone wrong at the deepest level of creation. Something introduced by beings powerful enough to contaminate the entire world and whose consequences were still being felt. The evil in the world had an origin story, and that origin story was not primarily about human failure. That is why communities copied this text 11 times and carried those copies into the desert to preserve them. The question of why First Enoch is not in most versions of the Bible is one that gets asked constantly, and it almost always gets asked in the wrong way. The question that gets asked is who decided to leave it out, and why did they want to hide it? That question assumes that canon was decided by a small group of powerful people in a single moment, sitting around a table and choosing what would be included and what would be suppressed. That is not how it happened. Canon formed slowly, over centuries, through the actual practice of communities reading and copying and arguing about texts. The texts that ended up in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament did not get there because someone selected them. They got there because generation after generation of communities treated them as authoritative, cited them in disputes, built theology around them, and copied them in numbers that far exceeded everything else. Authority was not declared from above. It was accumulated from below, through use. First Enoch was used heavily in the period around the turn of the Common Era. It is quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude, which means at least some early Christians treated it as authoritative enough to cite in a canonical letter. It remained canonical in the Ethiopian church, where it still sits alongside Genesis and Psalms as scripture to this day. What changed is not that someone decided to suppress it. What changed is that the communities that shaped the dominant traditions of both Judaism and Christianity moved in theological directions that made First Enoch's framework less central. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era, the Jewish tradition consolidated around the texts of the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinic interpretations of those texts. The Enochic tradition, with its elaborate angelic cosmology and its emphasis on heavenly journeys and revealed secrets, became a less central part of mainstream Jewish practice. It did not disappear. It went underground, surfacing in mystical traditions and in folklore. But it lost the institutional weight it had once carried. In Christianity, a similar narrowing happened. The angelic interpretation of Genesis 6, which First Enoch supports so directly, became increasingly uncomfortable for theologians who wanted to maintain clear boundaries between the divine and the human. By the time Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century, the Sethite interpretation was already winning the argument in Western Christianity. And a text like First Enoch, which told a story that the Sethite interpretation was specifically designed to avoid, became less relevant to the communities doing the copying. First Enoch was not hidden. It was set aside. And there is a difference. The difference matters because if it had been hidden, we would not have it. We have it because communities in Ethiopia never set it aside, and because a shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave in 1947 and heard something break. What First Enoch preserves is not a secret suppressed by powerful institutions. It is the oldest surviving attempt to fill the silence that Genesis 6 created, written by people who lived close enough to the world of Genesis that they may have understood things about that silence that we have since lost. When Jude quotes Enoch in the New Testament, he does not introduce the quotation by saying, "Here is an interesting ancient text." He says Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied. He treats Enoch's words as prophetic speech, as something that carries divine authority, as something that came from a person who walked with God and therefore knew what he was talking about. That is not how you quote folklore. That is how you quote scripture. And the words Jude chose to quote from the Enochic tradition are not about angels or giants or cosmology. They are about judgment, about the certainty that what has been done in darkness will be brought into light, about the fact that the structure of the universe bends, however slowly, toward accountability. Enoch walked with God, and what he saw, according to those who preserved his words through centuries of copying and hiding and carrying scrolls into desert caves, was that the world we live in is not the world as it was meant to be. Something happened. Something introduced a contamination that has been working its way through human experience ever since. The Watchers came down. The Nephilim walked the earth, and the echo of that descent is still moving through the world. First, Enoch did not invent the Nephilim. It gave them a story, and for the communities that read it as scripture, that story was not mythology. It was the explanation for everything they could see going wrong around them. That is what silence, filled with enough need, can produce. Here is the problem that almost nobody talks about. If the flood killed everything, why do giants keep showing up afterward? This is not a question from a conspiracy theory. This is a question from the Bible itself, because roughly 1,000 years after Noah steps off the ark in the narrative timeline of the Hebrew Scriptures, something happens that the text treats with complete seriousness, and that most readers, even careful readers, tend to move past too quickly. Moses is dead. The generation that left Egypt is almost entirely gone. A new generation of Israelites stands at the edge of Canaan, the land they have been promised for 400 years. And Moses sends 12 men to scout it before the people cross over. The 12 men go in. They spend 40 days moving through the land. They cut a single cluster of grapes so large it takes 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. The land is everything they were promised, rich and full and real. They bring back the grapes and the pomegranates and the figs as evidence. And then 10 of the 12 men stand before the assembled people of Israel and say something that changes everything. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. That sentence has been sitting in the book of Numbers for roughly 3,000 years. It is one of the most psychologically precise lines in the entire Hebrew Bible. The 10 men are not just reporting what they saw. They are reporting what they felt while they were seeing it. And what they felt was not just fear. It was a collapse of self. They looked at the Nephilim, and they stopped seeing themselves as human beings with dignity and agency. They became insects in their own imagination before a single giant had raised a hand against them. This is important. The Nephilim in Numbers do not attack the scouts. They do not threaten them. They simply exist, and their existence is enough to make 10 trained men. Men who had crossed the Red Sea and watched an empire's army drown behind them. Men who had survived 40 years in a desert that should have killed them. It is enough to make those men say, "We cannot do this." The 2 men who disagree, Caleb and Joshua do not dispute that giants are there. They do not say the other 10 are lying or exaggerating. They say we can overcome them. Same giants, different response. And that difference is the hinge on which the entire passage turns. Because what happens next is not a military defeat. No battle is fought. No blood is shed on either side. The Israelites hear the majority report, the one about the grasshoppers and the giants, and they break. They weep through the night. They talk about choosing a different leader and going back to Egypt. They are willing to return to slavery rather than face what the 10 men described. And God, in the text, is furious. Not because the giants scared them. Fear of something genuinely terrifying is understandable. God is furious because after everything they have witnessed, after every act of power that had been performed on their behalf, they still chose to believe that the giants were more real than the promise. They chose the evidence of their eyes over the evidence of their history. The sentence that comes back from God is devastating in its specificity. Not one person over the age of 20 who expressed that doubt will enter the promised land. They will wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day the scouts spent in Canaan, until every one of them has died. Their children will inherit what they refuse to trust. 40 years for a report about giants. That is the most concrete consequence of Nephilim in the entire Hebrew Bible. Not the flood, not the violence of the pre-flood world. A moment of collective fear, rooted in the sight of people who were very large. Costs an entire generation, their lives and their inheritance. The Nephilim never throw a single punch in this story. They just stand there, and the story falls apart around them. Now, step back and ask the question that the text immediately raises. If the flood wiped out the Nephilim, how are they in Canaan? The text in Numbers provides a partial answer that creates more questions than it resolves. The scouts describe the Nephilim as the descendants of Anak, and Anak as a descendant of the Nephilim. This creates a genealogical connection between the pre-flood world and the world the Israelites are entering. But it does not explain the mechanism. How did this lineage survive the flood? Did it survive through Noah's family somehow? Did it survive in some other way? The text does not say. What the text does do is something more interesting than answering the question. It uses the name Nephilim in Canaan as a statement about the nature of what Israel is facing at the border. Whatever the genealogical connection, calling the Anakim descendants of the Nephilim is a way of saying this is the same kind of thing, the same category of obstacle, the same quality of threat that the ancient world faced before the flood, and that the flood was supposed to resolve, has reappeared, and you have to decide what to do about it. After the wandering, after the 40 years, after the generation of the grasshoppers has died in the desert, and their children have grown up without the memory of Egypt, Israel crosses the Jordan under Joshua, and the campaign against the cities of Canaan becomes, in the text, partly a campaign against the lineages of the giant peoples. Og, the king of Bashan, appears in Deuteronomy as the last of the Rephaim, one of the several names the Hebrew Bible uses for the giant peoples of Canaan. His bed, the text mentions in a detail that seems almost domestic in its oddness, was made of iron and measured 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. The note about the bed is clearly meant to establish that he was real, that a physical object of verifiable dimensions existed as evidence of his size. This is not the language of myth. This is the language of a legal brief. Here is the proof. The Anakim are driven out of the hill country by Joshua. The text tracks where they go. Some of them end up in Gaza, some in Gath, some in Ashdod. They are not exterminated. They are scattered. Pushed to the edges of the world, the Israelites are establishing. Into the cities that will eventually be the home territory of the Philistines. Gath is where Goliath is from. This connection is almost always missed in popular tellings of the David and Goliath story, because the story is so powerful on its own terms. The young shepherd with a sling against the armored champion, that the genealogical dimension gets lost. But the text in 2 Samuel, in a passage that most people have never read, describes Goliath not as a unique individual, but as a member of a group. He has 4 relatives, all described as born to the giant in Gath, all of them fighting for the Philistines against Israel, all of them eventually killed by David's warriors. 4 relatives from a lineage that can be traced back to the Anakim, who can be traced back to the Nephilim, who appear in Genesis 6 in 4 verses before the flood. The Bible is not finished with the giants when the water rises. It keeps returning to them, keeps tracking them, keeps noting where they went and who defeated them and what remained of their lineage. There is something in the text that refuses to let the giants be simply a feature of the antediluvian world, a strange artifact of the time before the flood that the flood washed away. They keep coming back, smaller, perhaps, fewer, pushed to the edges, but there. And what they represent at each appearance is consistent even when the giants themselves are different. They represent the thing at the edge of the known world that makes you feel small. They represent the obstacle that looks too large to be overcome by ordinary means. They represent the moment when a person, or a community, has to decide whether to believe what they can see with their eyes or what they have been told about who they are and what they are capable of. The 10 grasshoppers chose their eyes. Caleb and Joshua chose something else. David, standing in the valley of Elah, across from a man who could have stepped on him, chose something else. The giant peoples of Canaan serve a specific narrative function in the Hebrew Bible that goes beyond the historical question of whether they were real, though that question is real and worth taking seriously. They are the recurring test of whether the people of Israel are who they believe themselves to be. Every time a giant appears at the edge of the story, someone has to make a choice about which reality is more real, the size of the thing in front of them, or the identity of the people they understand themselves to be. That function, that recurring test, is what explains why the text keeps returning to the giant peoples long after any historical record of them has faded. The Rephaim are mentioned in Genesis, in Deuteronomy, in Joshua, in 2 Samuel, in Isaiah, in Proverbs. They appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls in contexts that suggest the communities of Qumran were still thinking about them as meaningful categories more than 1,000 years after the last Anakim were driven from the hill country. You do not keep returning to something in your sacred texts for 1,000 years because it is a historical footnote. You return to it because it keeps telling you something about yourself that you need to keep hearing. Here is the honest answer to the question of whether the Nephilim survived the flood. The text never gives a fully satisfying answer. The descendants of Enoch in Numbers are described as coming from the Nephilim. but the mechanism of survival is left unexplained. The tradition of giant peoples in Canaan may have developed independently from the tradition of Nephilim in Genesis 6, with the connection between them being made by later editors or by the community's interpretive instinct that put similar seeming things in the same category. The archaeological record does not give us evidence of a race of people of extraordinary stature in ancient Canaan. What it gives us is evidence of Iron Age cities with massive fortifications, of a landscape that would have been genuinely daunting to a group of former slaves with no siege experience looking at it from outside. What looks like a giant from a distance sometimes looks different when you cross the border and find out what is actually there. But here is what the text is doing with all of this. And it matters more than the archaeological question. After the flood, the Nephilim do not return as a race. They return as a name for what terror looks like when it takes human form. They return as the thing standing between the person you are and the person you are trying to become. They return every time you stand at a border and have to decide whether you are a grasshopper or something else. The flood ended one world, but the thing the Nephilim represented, the meeting point of enormous power and the human inability to face it without losing yourself, that did not end with the water. It just moved to a different valley, a different border, a different moment when someone had to decide, and someone always has to decide. In 1842, a French archaeologist named Paul-Émile Botta arrived in northern Iraq with a mission that most of his colleagues considered a long shot. He was looking for Nineveh. Nineveh was the great capital of the Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful cities the ancient world had ever produced. Mentioned repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible as a symbol of everything that was vast and dangerous and foreign. The prophet Jonah was sent there. The prophet Nahum wrote an entire book celebrating its eventual destruction. For the people who produced the Hebrew scriptures, Nineveh was not a distant abstraction. It was the city that had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 before the Common Era, that had carried 10 tribes into captivity and scattered them so thoroughly that they have never been fully recovered by history. Botta did not find Nineveh on that first dig. He found something else, buried under decades of accumulated earth. He uncovered the ruins of a palace, massive carved stone panels, figures of extraordinary size rendered in bas-relief, winged beings with human bodies and animal heads, standing at the entrances to rooms as guardians, writing in a script that no living person could read. Over the following decades, as other excavations continued across Mesopotamia, that unreadable script was deciphered, and what scholars found written on the clay tablets they pulled from the earth was a literature that no one in the modern world had read for over 2,000 years. Among those texts was a poem. It had been copied and recopied on clay tablets across several centuries. It existed in multiple versions, in multiple languages, suggesting that it had traveled widely across the ancient Near East and been considered important enough to translate and preserve by cultures that did not even share a language with the civilization that first wrote it down. It told the story of a king, a man of extraordinary power and achievement, and his struggle with the most fundamental human problem. The king's name was Gilgamesh, and he was 2/3 divine. That fraction is where this story begins to matter for what we are talking about. 2/3 divine. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not explain exactly what that means in biological terms. And it does not need to. The ancient audience understood immediately what was being described. Gilgamesh is the product of a union between a divine being and a human woman. He exists at the boundary between two worlds. He is stronger than any ordinary man, more beautiful, more capable, more driven. He builds the great walls of Uruk. He performs feats that no one else can perform. He is, in the language the text reaches for, a man of renown. That phrase appears in Genesis 6. In the 4 verses about the Nephilim, the heroes of old, men of renown. In Hebrew the word is Shem, which means name, reputation, the mark a person leaves on the world that outlasts their body. The men of renown in Genesis are defined by the same thing that defines Gilgamesh. They are beings whose existence was so far beyond the ordinary that the world remembered them long after they were gone. The connection between Gilgamesh and the Nephilim tradition is not a secret that scholars discovered last week. It has been discussed since the tablets were first translated in the 19th century, but it is regularly misunderstood in 2 opposite directions. And both misunderstandings obscure what is actually interesting about the relationship. The first misunderstanding is to say that Genesis copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, that the Nephilim are simply the Hebrew version of Gilgamesh, and the stories are essentially the same story, with different names. This is not accurate. The 2 traditions share a symbolic vocabulary, a set of images and categories and concerns that appear to come from the same broader cultural world. But they use that vocabulary to say very different things. They are not the same story. They are, in an important sense, arguments with each other. The second misunderstanding is to say that the similarities are coincidental or irrelevant. That Genesis is a divinely revealed text operating in a completely separate category from ancient Near Eastern literature, and that comparing them is a category error. This is also not accurate. And it prevents you from seeing something that is genuinely illuminating about what Genesis is doing. What is actually true is more interesting than either of those positions. Genesis was composed and preserved and edited into its final form in a world where the Epic of Gilgamesh was not an obscure text known only to specialists. It was the great literature of the dominant culture. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era and carried the Jewish leadership into captivity, the people who maintained the tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures spent decades living inside the civilization that had produced Gilgamesh. They heard those stories. They knew that symbolic vocabulary. And when they wrote and edited and arranged their own texts, they were doing so in full awareness of the world those texts would be read in. Genesis 6 is not naive about Mesopotamian tradition. It is in conversation with it. To understand what that conversation is, you need to know a few things about the world that the Epic of Gilgamesh describes. In the Mesopotamian tradition, before the Great Flood, the world was governed by beings who were part divine and part human. These beings built the first cities, established the first laws, created the conditions under which civilization became possible. They were not simply rulers. They were the conduit through which divine order was transmitted into the human world. Without them, human beings would have no civilization, no agriculture, no writing, no law. They were the necessary bridge between heaven and earth. The beings who played this role in Mesopotamian cosmology were called the Apkallu, 7 of them, in the most common version of the tradition, appearing before the flood and serving as the teachers and guardians of humanity. They are depicted in the art and literature of the period as figures with the bodies of men and the features of fish, emerging from the waters that were understood as the source of divine wisdom. They carry objects associated with the sacred rites of purification and protection. After the flood, the tradition continues. The Apkallu still exist, but they are diminished. The post-flood world has human sages, people of great wisdom and learning. But they are not the same as the pre-flood Apkallu. Something was lost when the waters rose and fell. The world on the other side of the flood is a lesser world, and the beings who inhabit it are lesser beings. Wise perhaps, but no longer capable of the direct divine transmission that the Apkallu represented. In this tradition, the world before the flood is the better world. The mighty ones, the semi-divine figures who stood at the intersection of heaven and earth, are the best thing that ever happened to humanity. Their loss is mourned. The flood is a catastrophe, not because it was deserved, but because it ended something precious. Now put that tradition next to Genesis 6. In Genesis 6, beings from the divine sphere come down to earth and unite with human women. The result is the Nephilim, the mighty men, the heroes of old, men of renown, and then the flood comes. But in Genesis, the flood is not a catastrophe imposed on an innocent world. It is a judgment on a world that had become corrupt. And the mighty men, the men of renown, are placed in the text immediately before that judgment. Not as the best thing that happened to humanity, but as part of the reason judgment became necessary. Same basic structure, divine beings, human women, mighty offspring, great flood. But the moral orientation is completely reversed, where Mesopotamian tradition remembers the semi-divine beings of the pre-flood world as heroes, as civilizers, as the source of everything valuable in human culture. Genesis places beings of the same general description inside a world so thoroughly corrupted that God decides it needs to be destroyed and rebuilt from one righteous man and his family. This is not coincidence. This is argument. Genesis is taking the Mesopotamian framework and reorienting it. It is saying you have these stories about the mighty men before the flood, these heroes whose divine blood made them extraordinary. We know those stories. And here is what we think about them. The world they built was not the best world. It was a world that ended in judgment. Whatever the mighty men were, whatever the sons of God and the daughters of men produced together, the result was not civilization. The result was a world that God looked at and said, I will wipe this out and start again. That reorientation has profound implications for how power is understood in the two traditions. In the Mesopotamian tradition, power that comes from divine origin is good. It is the source of law, of culture, of everything that raises human life above the level of animals. The semi-divine king, the man whose blood carries the divine element, is the legitimate ruler precisely because of what he carries. His strength is his qualification. In the Genesis tradition, power that exceeds human scale and operates without constraint is exactly what God destroys. The mighty men, the men of renown, are not the justification for the world before the flood. They are the symptom of what went wrong. The world did not need beings of extraordinary power to show it how to live. It needed obedience, covenant, faithfulness, and the world that organized itself around the mighty men instead of around those things is the world that the flood erased. This argument matters to us because we are still having it. Every culture in every century has to decide what to do with the question of extraordinary power, whether the person who can do more than others, who has more strength or more money or more influence or more force of will, whether that person deserves the authority their capability might give them, or whether capability is simply capability and authority requires something else entirely. The Mesopotamian tradition said capability was enough. The divine blood justified the rule. Genesis said no, and it made its case by pointing at a world where that logic had been tried, and showing what it produced. What it produced was a world that had to be drowned. Now, there is one more tradition from the ancient Near East that deserves attention here, because it sits directly between the Mesopotamian tradition and the Genesis account in a way that illuminates both. In the Ugaritic texts, documents discovered in modern-day Syria in the 1920s that date to roughly the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era, there are extensive references to a group called the Rephaim. This is the same word that appears in the Hebrew Bible as one of the names for the giant peoples of Canaan, the ones associated with Og of Bashan and the lineages that Joshua drove out of the hill country. In the Ugaritic texts, the Rephaim are the spirits of dead warriors of extraordinary size and power. They are summoned to feasts. They ride through the night on chariots. They exist in the space between the world of the living and the world of the dead, powerful enough to be called on for protection, but belonging fully to neither realm. The Hebrew Bible uses the word Rephaim in two distinct ways. Sometimes it refers to the giant peoples of Canaan, the living descendants of the ancient mighty men. Sometimes it refers to the dead, the shades or spirits that inhabit the underworld, a category of being that is no longer fully alive, but has not fully ceased to exist either. That double meaning is not an accident of linguistic history. It is a reflection of something real in the way the ancient world thought about beings who had existed at the boundary between the human and the divine. The Rephaim were mighty in life. After death, they remained something, not fully present, not fully gone, haunting the edges of the world in a way that ordinary human dead did not. The Nephilim of Genesis 6 are placed at a similar kind of boundary. They exist at the threshold between the old world and the world the flood is about to destroy. They are mentioned, and then the waters rise. What happens to them is never said, but the tradition that calls the dead warriors Rephaim, and the tradition that calls the pre-flood mighty men Nephilim, and the tradition that remembers the giant peoples of Canaan as the descendants of those ancient categories, are all circling around the same underlying intuition. Some kinds of power do not end cleanly. Some kinds of power leave a residue, something that was too large to simply stop when it stopped, too significant to vanish without a trace, too close to the boundary between worlds to fully disappear when the world moved on. The flood came. The waters rose and fell. Noah stepped off the ark into a world that was supposed to be clean. And yet something remained, not in spite of the flood, perhaps because of what the flood was responding to. Because some things, once they have been introduced into the structure of the world, do not wash out completely. They change form. They go underground. They appear in different valleys, under different names, carrying the same essential weight. The ancient Near East knew this. The Mesopotamians encoded it in the diminished sages of the post-flood world. The Ugaritic tradition encoded it in the Rephaim, who rode their chariots through the night. The Hebrew Bible encoded it in the giant peoples who kept appearing at the borders of the Promised Land for 1,000 years after the flood should have ended them. Genesis took all of that inherited symbolic world and made a single, decisive argument about it. The mighty men before the flood were not the best of what humanity could be. They were the proof of what humanity became when power was freed from accountability, and the world that housed them did not deserve to survive. In the year 415 of the Common Era, Augustine of Hippo was working on what would become the most ambitious theological project of his life. The City of God was Augustine's attempt to explain the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, an event that had shaken the Roman world so thoroughly that people were still trying to understand what it meant 5 years later. Rome had been the eternal city. Rome had been, for generations of Christians, the place where the faith had found its institutional home. If Rome could fall, what did that say about the God who was supposed to protect it? Augustine's answer required him to build a complete theology of history, and in the course of building that framework, he came to Genesis 6. He came to the Nephilim, and he wrote something that changed how Western Christianity thought about giants for the next 1,000 years. Augustine told his readers that he had personally seen, on the shore of the sea near Utica in North Africa, a human molar tooth of such extraordinary size that it could have been cut into 100 teeth of ordinary human dimensions. He presented this not as a legend or a second-hand account, but as something he had witnessed himself. He used it to argue that the people before the flood were genuinely, physically larger than the people of his own time, and that the Nephilim were exactly what the text suggested. Augustine was not a credulous man. He was one of the most rigorous thinkers the ancient world produced. When Augustine said he had seen something, people believed him. The problem, which no one in his era had the tools to recognize, is that the tooth almost certainly belonged to an elephant or a whale or some other large animal whose remains had washed onto the North African shore. The ancient world had no systematic way of identifying animal bones that looked superficially human. A large molar is a large molar if you expect giants. A large molar is evidence of giants. But what matters more than the mistake is what Augustine established: a framework, a set of interpretive habits that his culture would bring to the earth for the next 1,000 years. When you find something large and inexplicable in the ground, you know what it is. The text already told you. You are not discovering something new. You are confirming something old. That framework shaped how Europe understood its own landscape in ways that became so pervasive they turned invisible. Throughout the Middle Ages, bones of extraordinary size turned up across Europe with a regularity that the modern world would explain as the remains of mammoths and mastodons. Each discovery was interpreted through the lens Augustine had established. Church inventories from the medieval period include items listed simply as bones of giants, displayed as curiosities or as sacred relics, objects that connected the physical world of the worshipper to the scriptural world they understood through Genesis. Finding giants in the earth was a way of touching the Bible. What is striking is not the mistake. What is striking is the need that drove the framework. People were not looking for mammoth bones out of curiosity about prehistoric megafauna. They were looking for confirmation of a story that they needed to be true. The Nephilim were not just an interesting feature of Genesis 6. They were evidence that the world of the Bible was the real world, that the text was speaking not about a distant mythological realm, but about the actual ground beneath their feet. Every age builds the giants it needs. Now move forward roughly 1400 years. The eastern half of North America was covered with mounds, thousands of them. Earthworks constructed by indigenous peoples over thousands of years. When European Americans began moving into the Ohio and Mississippi valleys in large numbers in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they encountered these mounds and immediately began asking who had built them. The answer that many settlers found most satisfying was that the mounds had been built by a vanished race of giants, a people of extraordinary size and sophistication who had been destroyed or displaced by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples currently living in the region. This theory accomplished several things at once. It severed the connection between the impressive mounds and the indigenous peoples who were being displaced to make room for American expansion. It populated the American past with a lost civilization more impressive than anything the surviving cultures could claim. And it connected the American landscape to the scriptural tradition of Nephilim and giant peoples, making the continent itself a site of biblical history. Newspaper accounts throughout the 19th century reported the discovery of enormous skeletons in mounds and fields across the Midwest. Some of these reports were outright fabrications. Some were honest misidentifications of animal remains. Some were genuine anomalies that the science of the time had no framework to properly assess. The Smithsonian Institution investigated many of these claims and consistently found that the evidence did not support the reports. But the reports kept coming, and they kept being believed, because the framework that Augustine had established over 1,000 years earlier was still doing its work. If the text says there were giants, and you find something large in the ground, you already know what it is. Now move to the 21st century. The archaeological and scientific evidence does not support the claims that modern giant traditions make about human history. That needs to be said clearly before anything else. There are no verified skeletal remains of people of extraordinary stature hidden in Smithsonian vaults. The pyramid builders were human. The ancient monuments that seem too ambitious for their era are the products of organized human labor, not visitors from elsewhere. But something is happening in the 21st century that deserves honest attention, because dismissing it without understanding it misses the more interesting question. By the time Ancient Aliens premiered on television in 2009, the Nephilim had been completely remixed into a new explanatory framework. The sons of God and the Watchers, who descended from the heavens in Genesis and First Enoch, were reinterpreted not as divine beings in the theological sense, but as extraterrestrials. The Nephilim were not the children of fallen angel. They were hybrid offspring of an alien species that had interbred with early humans. The forbidden knowledge the Watchers brought was not supernatural revelation. It was advanced technology, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, all the things that allowed early civilizations to develop faster than they should have been able to on their own. The flood was not divine judgment. It was a reset, a cover-up, an event whose true cause has been suppressed by the people who write the official history. This might seem like a radical departure from the religious tradition. Structurally, it is not. The Ancient Aliens framework preserves every element of the Nephilim story that has always been most compelling. Beings of extraordinary power descended from a higher realm to interact with humanity. Their interaction changed human beings in ways that cannot be explained by ordinary development. The world that resulted had secrets, powers, and histories that the official accounts have suppressed or failed to recognize. And somewhere in the ground, in the archaeology that the mainstream refuses to take seriously, the evidence is waiting. The only things that changed are the labels. Heaven became outer space. Divine beings became extraterrestrials. Forbidden knowledge became advanced technology. Religious authorities became government agencies and academic institutions. The emotional architecture is identical, and that architecture connects to something real in the experience of the people who find it compelling. We live in a world where official accounts have repeatedly turned out to be incomplete or dishonest, where institutions trusted to tell the truth have proved capable of systematic deception, where the gap between what is publicly known and what is privately known about the exercise of power has never felt wider. Into that world, the ancient aliens framework says, the story you were given is not the whole story. The history is larger than the version you were taught. The evidence is there if you know how to look for it. That is a claim about knowledge and about who gets to decide what counts as true. And that claim has been made in every century since Augustine picked up a tooth on a beach and knew immediately, with complete certainty, what he was looking at. He was wrong about the tooth. He was not wrong about the need. The need is still reaching, in the earth, in the stars, in the silence that Genesis 6 left open, and that no official account has managed to close. Every age builds the giants it needs, and the giants it builds always carry the shape of what that age is most afraid of losing. Go back to Genesis 6 one more time, not to find something you missed. Go back to read what is actually there, with everything you now know sitting alongside the text. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 4 verse, the same 4 verses that started all of this. Read them now, and something is different. Not in the text, in you, because you have been somewhere since the last time you read those words. You have been to the summit of Mount Hermon, where 200 beings made a decision they knew was wrong and made it anyway. You have stood at the edge of Canaan, where 10 men looked at something large and stopped seeing themselves as human. You have been to a beach in North Africa, where a bishop picked up a tooth and knew instantly what it confirmed. You have been to the desert caves where scrolls waited 2,000 years for a shepherd boy to throw a stone. The text has not changed, but you have more of the world in you now, and that changes what the silence sounds like. So sit with the silence for a moment before reaching for an explanation. The writer of Genesis, or the community of writers and editors who shaped it into the form we have it in, was not careless. The Hebrew Bible is the product of extraordinary care, copied by scribes who would recopy entire pages for a single error, argued over by generations of scholars who treated every word as something that mattered. When a text that careful leaves something unexplained, the absence is a choice. The Nephilim are unexplained. That is a choice. And it is worth asking what the choice is doing. One answer is that the text is assuming knowledge the original audience already had. The 4 verses were not mysterious to the people who first heard them, because those people lived inside a world of shared storytelling that filled in what the text left out. Genesis 6 was not a riddle. It was a shorthand, a condensed version of a story that everyone in the room already knew. The way a modern reference does not need to be explained, because the audience can supply the context themselves. Under this reading, the silence is an artifact of time. What we experience as mystery was not experienced as mystery by the people the text was written for. We created the mystery by losing the context. That is probably partly true, but there is another answer, and it is harder to set aside. Maybe the silence is the point. Think about what happens to the story if the Nephilim are fully explained. If Genesis told you clearly that the sons of God were angels, that they came down and had children with human women, that the Nephilim were those children, that their existence was the cause of the flood, the story becomes a closed equation. Sin and judgment, cause and effect. The giants did wrong. God responded. The world was cleaned up and started again. The story resolves. It closes. It gives you something you can carry forward and file away. But Genesis does not do that. It places the Nephilim before the flood without clearly making them the cause of the flood. It mentions them as though their existence is simply a fact about the world, requiring no more justification than the existence of mountains or rivers. And then it moves on. That refusal to resolve creates something that a resolution could not create. A question that stays open. A space in the text that never closes. And questions that stay open do not sit there passively. They reach into the reader. They pull on the parts of the reader that have their own unresolved things, their own experiences of standing at a border and finding something there that should not exist but does. The Nephilim have lasted 2,500 years, not because the text explained them. They have lasted because the text refused to. Now consider what their position in the story tells you. Genesis places the Nephilim at the end of the old world, in the last chapter before the flood, in the final verses before God decides that what has been built has to come down. In a carefully structured text, the thing you place right before the climax carries the weight of explanation without needing to state it. It shows you the state of the world at the moment the world ran out of time. The Nephilim are not the cause of the flood, the way a crime is the cause of a verdict. They are the symptom. They are what the world looks like when it has arrived somewhere the original design never intended. Somewhere that requires not correction, but a complete new beginning. And that is why they cannot be fully explained. Because what they represent is not a specific transgression with a specific remedy. It is a condition. The condition of a world that has moved past the point where its own resources can bring it back. Every generation that has reached into that silence has been reaching for that condition. Not because they were confused about ancient history, because they recognized it. The scholars who wrote First Enoch were living inside a world that felt contaminated at the root, where foreign empires crushed the righteous, and the structure of things seemed bent toward outcomes that justice could not explain. They needed to know that the contamination had a history, that the brokenness of their world was not the original design, but the legacy of something that had gone wrong before, something the flood had tried to wash away, but whose effects were still working through the world. The medieval scholars who found giants in the earth and displayed their bones were living inside a world where meaning required the physical to confirm the scriptural. The giants in the ground were not evidence in the modern sense. They were the world confirming that the text was true. The 21st century communities that believe in hidden histories and suppressed discoveries are living inside a world where official knowledge has repeatedly proved incomplete, where the gap between what is publicly known and what is privately known has never felt wider. The giants in the suppressed files say the story you were given is not the whole story. Each of these communities reached into the same silence. Each pulled out something shaped by what they needed, and each was asking a real question, even when the answer they found was not the right one. What makes Genesis 6 remarkable is that it held all of them. The same 4 verses absorbed Second Temple angelology and medieval relic culture and 21st century conspiracy theory without collapsing under any of it. The silence proved large enough for every generation to find something in it. That is not a coincidence of textual vagueness. That is what it looks like when a text touches something permanent. The permanent thing is this. There is a question that human beings in every culture and every century have found themselves unable to stop asking. It takes different forms depending on who is asking and what world they are asking it inside. But underneath the different forms, it is always the same. What happens when something that should not exist does? What happens when the boundary between the possible and the impossible is crossed? When the thing that was supposed to stay on one side of a line appears on the other side? When the rules that govern the structure of the world turn out to be not quite as absolute as everyone assumed? The Nephilim are the Bible's way of holding that question open. They are placed at the boundary of the old world and the new, at the threshold of the flood, in the last light before everything changes. They are given just enough presence to be felt, just enough weight to register, and then the waters rise and the story moves forward. But the shadow they cast does not move with the water. It is in the letter of Jude, where the writer reaches for Enoch to describe judgment, because Enoch alone tells you what the pre-flood world was actually judged for. It is in the valley of Elah, where a young man with a sling decides that what he knows about himself is more real than the size of the man standing across from him. It is in the cave above the Dead Sea, where the scrolls waited in the dark for the stone. Genesis never tells you what the Nephilim were, but it tells you where they stood, at the edge, at the end, in the last light of the world before the water came. And maybe that is enough, because here is what 2,500 years of reaching into that silence has actually produced. Not an answer, not a consensus, not a settled account of who the sons of God were, or what the Nephilim looked like, or whether any of them survived the flood. What it has produced is a record of every generation that felt the question deeply enough to try. Every community that recognized something in those 4 verses that their own world had given them a version of. Every person who read past the genealogies and the long lifespans of the early chapters of Genesis and stopped, suddenly, at this strange passage, and felt something that people have been feeling for 3,000 years when they arrive here. That something is here that the story is not fully accounting for, that the silence is holding something, that the shadow falls across the threshold and does not lift when the next sentence begins. The flood came. The old world ended. Noah stepped off the ark into a world that was supposed to be clean, supposed to be new, supposed to be free of whatever had made the old world unredeemable. And the world began again. But Genesis never says the shadow lifted. It just says the water fell, And in the silence between what the water washed away and what it left behind, the question is still there, not for an answer, for the next person willing to take it seriously. Genesis never lets you stare at the Nephilim for long. It gives you their shadow, and then it gives you the flood. The shadow is still there. It has been there for 3,000 years, and it is still long enough to reach you.